These are my first impressions on the newly released Sony A1 mirrorless camera. Hey folks, I'm Juan Pons, and I'm here in beautiful Salisbury Beach Reserve in Massachusetts. And I came here explicitly to test out the new Sony A1 mirrorless camera that I recently received. And I have to tell you that I'm very impressed with this camera. I came here to shoot especially birds in flight. I've been able to photograph snowy owls, long-eared owls, short-eared owls, and northern harriers. And specifically birds in flight, which is one of the things that's going to test the autofocus system on these cameras the most. And I have to tell you, without going into all sorts of other stuff, because like I said, this is a first impressions. I am incredibly impressed at the autofocus performance of this camera. I was able to get these birds in flight, in focus, more so than I've ever been able to before. Why don't we check out this really quick sequence right now? And this sequence is of a snowy owl that was flying straight towards me, and I got about 150 shots at 30 frames per second, and all of these frames are tack sharp in focus. And if you're a bird photographer, you know that birds in flight is one of the hardest things to photograph. I've also been able to get northern harriers in flight very, very accurately and very, very sharp. I've been very impressed as well with the image quality of this camera, which for me is one of the most important qualities of any camera. Yes, the autofocus system is important, but if the image quality is not there, the autofocus system is really not going to do much else for me. A couple of things about the camera that I like. I like the form factor. It's very similar in the ergonomics, and they're very similar to the A7R4, as well as the A9 Mark II and the A7S Mark III. As a matter of fact, the plate that you should be able to use on this camera from Really Right Stuff is the plate that's made for the A7S III. Do not use the plate for the A7R4. If it's one of the earlier versions, you want to get one of the newer versions, the B or C versions of the plates for the A7R3, which is also the same plate that's used on the A7S III, as well as the A9. I'm sorry, did I say A7R3? I mean A7R4. So it's version B or version C of the A7R4 plate, which is the one that's recommended for the A7S III. I know this is a jumble of numbers and models, but it's important because if you put the original A version of the A7R4 plate on this camera, you actually run the risk of messing up the bottom part of the camera itself. Now, as you notice here on my camera, I only have the bottom plate. I don't have the L plate because the L plate does not fit well. So that's being retooled by Really Right Stuff. I just wanted to throw that in there because I haven't seen anybody talk about which plate actually fits from Really Right Stuff on this camera. And for me, the plates are super, super important to use on any of my cameras. A couple of things that are different on this camera is the top layout. Now we have another dial on the left-hand side of the camera where you actually change the drive mode as well as the autofocus mode, whether it's continuous or single or manual focus. Kind of neat that it's over here. I do like that, and both of these dials have little locks to them, so you have to press a button and turn their dials so you don't hit those accidentally. So they actually work really well. You can get also confirmations in the viewfinder or the back screen as to which mode you're in if you had any questions about that. Another thing that I really like is that it does appear, and I read this from Sony, is that they've actually improved the weather sealing on the camera. It's the best weather sealing that we've seen on any of the Alpha cameras. And you can tell that by the little doors on the side. They're much better designed, and they close a lot more securely than before. And there's a new locking mechanism on the battery door as well, which I really enjoy because it's a lot more secure in the way that you open it. Now, talking about that little door, the other thing that's really new about this camera is the new memory cards that you can use with this camera. This camera can use, in addition to the traditional SD cards, and you should be using the UHS 2 cards like these from Sony, which are the fastest cards that are out there in SD. But these new CF Express Type A cards are way faster than the traditional SD cards, and they are sturdier. They are really tough. I've always been concerned about the SD cards because I've always felt like I was going to break them because they're so thin and fragile. These are way thicker and way sturdier. Now, the big drawback to these is that they're very expensive. Right now, only Sony is making these cards. So that's why they're really expensive. This 160 gig card is about $400. Well, whether that's worth it to you or not, that's a personal question, and depending on your finances. But I expect those to go down in price quite a bit once we see other manufacturers come into play and produce these kind of cards as well. Now, the big advantage of these new cards, as opposed to, in addition to being so sturdy, is that they're way faster. In my testing, they're about twice as fast as the fastest SD cards. We're talking about 700 megabits per second or so, whereas the other ones were about 300 megabits per second. Much faster at offloading that buffer on the camera. And in my testing, what I found is that even when you fill the buffer, you can be shooting at about 10 frames per second, even after you fill that buffer. So pretty impressive with these cards. Everything else about the camera is pretty much the same. It uses the same batteries as before. The viewfinder is the other thing that's really improved, and it makes a big difference when you look into that viewfinder. The image is much crisper, much clearer, brighter, and you don't get to see those pixels anymore like you did with the other cameras. This has so many pixels on it that it truly looks like an optical viewfinder in image quality, especially when you turn it on to the highest frame rate. That's something that you have to do in the settings. Other than that, the cameras are very similar to the other ones. I'm not going to talk about the video features because it does have some advanced video features, like I know it can shoot 8K, but that's not something that I do all that often. So for me, it's more about stills camera. And the bottom line is that autofocus is incredible on this camera. The best autofocus of any camera I've ever used. I'm very impressed, but I'm going to still keep testing. I'm going to do a lot more testing to make sure that what I encountered this time around wasn't just a fluke. But so far, like I said before, I have been incredibly impressed. I know I've said it like 10 times already, but that's how excited I am about this autofocus camera. Yes, it is a very, very expensive camera. We're talking about $6,500 just for the camera. But you know what? That is not out of line when you compare it to the top of the line in Canon and Nikon. And that's what this is. This is a professional camera, top of the line professional camera. So when you compare it with the other competitors that are out there, it's not, out of line, so to speak. And it does much more than a lot of those cameras do. No other camera out there can shoot at 50 megapixels at 30 frames a second. That is just absolutely bonkers. And in that sequence that you saw earlier, that snowy owl, I have so many frames, I'm able to get those wings in the exact perfect position that I want. And that's where that 30 frames per second comes in very, very handy. It's not something I'm going to be doing all the time. I'm not going to be shooting 30 frames per second all the time. I'm only going to do it when I'm shooting birds in flight, because that's when I want to be able to pick that wing position in the exact perfect wing position that I'm looking for. Anyways, keep on the lookout. I'm going to be making a couple more videos about the camera. I'm going to talk about the settings, like my other comprehensive video on settings for the A7R4. I'm going to do a comprehensive video on this camera on settings, and I hope to do a longer form evaluation on the camera as well and tell you all the findings and everything in much more detail. Hope to see you on the next video. Take care.